and welcome back to The Revolution is News. I'm Karin Wulf, the director and librarian of the John Carter Brown Library. And this, as those of you who have been following along know, is our effort to create a kind of video resource for folks who are reading, writing, thinking about the American Revolution in this commemorative year. We've asked about a dozen, well, actually about a baker's dozen scholars who are specialists in the field to join us for conversations on particular topics, to give us their kind of deep dive on research subjects that we think will be illuminating for teachers, for especially journalists, but also those of us who are just interested in the period in 2026 and beyond. It's a particular pleasure today to welcome back to the JCB Dr. Emily Sneff. This will be her third appearance at the JCB in just a couple of years. It's always great to have Emily with us. Dr. Sneff earned her PhD at William & Mary and also her MA at William & Mary. She also has a BA from Johns Hopkins University Press, from Johns Hopkins University. Sorry, I'm jumping ahead here. The big news, of course, is that her wonderful new book, When the Declaration of Independence Was News, was published by Oxford University Press this year. She's a consulting curator for museum exhibitions for the 250th, of course, including at the Museum of the American Revolution. Was delighted to see that exhibit recently. It's fantastic, but she's also doing a lot of work for Historic Trap. She was an integral part of the Declaration Resources Project at Harvard University, led by Danielle Allen, which won international recognition for, among other things, locating and identifying a second parchment copy of the Declaration of Independence in a rather obscure British local archive. It's a bit of a spoiler there. It was not an 18th century one. It's a really interesting story. Her work has earned many accolades as well as media attention, including a fellowship right here at the JCB, of course, and also at the McNeil Center for Early American Studies. She's very, very busy this year. She is zipping around doing more than one event, I think, per day. It's truly a pleasure to have her join us to talk about the Declaration of Independence. I can't imagine a better guide to this all-important subject this year. Welcome, Emily.
Thank you, Karin. I'm so glad to be back at the JCB in this capacity. And I just have a few slides to share, some sort of visuals to help guide our conversation. Because as Karin mentioned, the title of the book really says it all, When the Declaration of Independence Was News. This book reflects about a decade of research, and it really is my effort to contribute to the 250th in a way that I think is unique from past books about the Declaration, as well as books that are being published this year. My approach to the Declaration really centers on this idea that the parchment, the signed copy of the Declaration, doesn't tell all the stories, that there are many more copies of the Declaration from 1776 that survive. And in fact, by studying all of these different copies, we get a much clearer sense of just how messy the work of publishing the news of independence to the world really was. And I mean messy in two senses of the word. First of all, there's a messiness in terms of a lack of efficiency in communication. There's copies of the Declaration that did not reach their intended destinations. There's individuals who refuse to participate in the process of declaring independence. And there's a sort of a diplomatic side of how the news of independence spread that didn't quite go smoothly for the Continental Congress. And I explore all of those different aspects in the book. There is also a material messiness to how the news of independence spread. There's a reason why there's ink splatters on the cover of my book. There's ink splatters on copies of the Declaration. There's scratch math in the margins of different copies. There's ink that has bled through or faded over time. There's smudgy fingerprints. There's dingy paper. There's all this sort of material messiness, which both is a different way of looking at the Declaration, but also is a reflection of just how many people were involved in the work of publishing the news. So that's my approach. And the other thing that's unique about the book is that it focuses on a very specific period of time when the Declaration was news. And for me, this period of time stretches from May 1776 to January 1777. So it's a 9-month window, sort of wedged in between two vast historiographies of the Declaration. There are many books that have been written and continue to be written about the Declaration's Enlightenment influences, the drafting process, the sort of the language behind the Declaration. And then there are many books and other resources like museum exhibits, which explore the Declaration's impact through time over the last 250 years, the many international independence movements as well as civil rights movements, which have drawn inspiration from this text from 1776. And my book is wedged right in the middle of those two historiographies in this 9-month period of time, which frankly only typically receives a paragraph or two of attention in other books about the Declaration. There tends to be a very quick mention of the fact that it was published initially in Philadelphia and then in other places. There are certain episodes that receive attention. For example, the gilded leaden statue of King George III being torn down in New York City. But there has been lacking a sort of thorough exploration of how the news of independence spread, all of the different places it reached, and all of the different reactions to the news. So the reason why I focus on May to January is in May, the Continental Congress, the body that was meeting in Philadelphia to sort of advocate on behalf of the colonies and ultimately to decide whether or not to declare independence or not. In May, they issued a resolution which was treated by some people, both in Congress and outside of Congress, as a declaration of independence. It was a resolution which recommended that each of the colonies should establish new representative governments. But the preamble of that resolution marked the first time when the Continental Congress explicitly blamed King George III for what the colonists were experiencing. And so because of that, this, what I call May 15th resolution, was treated as a declaration, and it sort of starts the clock ticking. And there's anticipation and questions about what a Declaration of Independence would actually look like. And then the timeline for me continues through the summer and the actual Declaration of Independence, which was approved on July 4th. And it wraps up in January of 1777 with a particular printing of the Declaration, which I'll show you in just a moment, which marks the end of the time when the Declaration was news. Because this printing was intended to be sent out to every state to lay the foundation of each state's archive. And so that's where we get this transition point from the Declaration as a news item to the Declaration as archival treasure. So there are many other books that tell a much broader story of the Declaration. Some examples include David Armitage's book about the global history of the Declaration, Pauline Mayer's book, American Scripture, which is my personal favorite exploration of the drafting process. And also she highlights the many local declarations of independence, which came in 1776 and, in the years surrounding that time. And then there's also newer books, for example, Rob Parkinson's work in The Common Cause, 13 Clocks, and his new book, Tyrants and Rogues, which focuses on the grievances in the Declaration of Independence. And this work, I think, helps to situate all of those books that are kind of looking at the broader context and really think about how that information was presented to the people and then how the people reacted to it. So the first printing of the Declaration looked like this. It was John Dunlap's broadside or poster-sized sheet with the Declaration printed on one side. Dunlap was a Northern Irish immigrant printer. And as you can probably imagine, there's a lot of excitement about Dunlap's role in independence in Northern Ireland. So I've done some interviews with BBC Northern Ireland and other news outlets who are fascinated by this Northern Irish immigrant printer's role in publishing the news of independence. Dunlap was an established printer in Philadelphia. His office was just a few blocks from Independence Hall, where the Congress was meeting. And he produced probably a few hundred of these broadsides, which were intended to be sent out to each of the states and then also to George Washington at the head of the Continental Army. And just to orient you to how the text appears on the page, we have the first two paragraphs after that big initial W. That's the preamble of the Declaration. And that's where we find the parts that are still familiar to many Americans and people around the world 250 years later. All men are created equal, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's all up front in those first two paragraphs, which lay the foundation of natural rights on which the premise of independence is based. And then the longest part of the Declaration is the list of grievances about King George III. There's 27 of them in the final version of the text that was printed. And then the final paragraph itself is the Declaration. That is the Declaration of Independence, the declaration of a transition from British colonies to the free and independent United States of America. So I like to remind folks, because we take the Declaration for granted, that everything before that final paragraph could have looked different. It could have been longer or shorter or structured differently. That final paragraph was what absolutely had to be in the Declaration of Independence, which is effectively a press release announcing the Continental Congress's decision to declare independence from Great Britain. When the Declaration travels to Europe, in some cases it is printed in full, or extracted. And when it is extracted, when it's not printed in its entirety, it's that final paragraph that receives the most attention, because that is the core message of 1776. Although many generations of people have been inspired by the principles of equality and liberty that are laid out in the opening lines of the Declaration, in 1776, what was newsworthy was that final paragraph that was articulating the separation from Great Britain. Now, after Dunlap's broadsides, which were printed on the night of July 4th into the day on July 5th, the Declaration was printed by other printers as well, in broadside form, but also in every active newspaper in the United States, beginning on Saturday, July 6th, with Benjamin Towne's Pennsylvania Evening Post. This was a tri-weekly newspaper at a time when most newspapers were printed once a week. And so Towne seized the opportunity to get the news in front of his readers as quickly as possible, and he beat out all of his competitors in Philadelphia. From this newspaper on July 6th, the Declaration was printed in every active newspaper, stretching from New Hampshire all the way down to South Carolina. There weren't active newspapers in Georgia and some of the other states at this moment because of the ongoing war. So I use that caveat of every active newspaper as a reminder that printers were disrupted by the ongoing conflict with Great Britain. And then within a few days of July 4th, the Declaration was also translated into German. There was a significant German-American population in the colonies, which became the United States. 250,000 German-American people were living in the colonies at the time of independence. I'm descended from some of those people who lived in the greater Philadelphia area. And it warms my heart that they had access to the Declaration in the language in which they operated their day-to-day lives. So these German translations offer an important reminder, especially during the 250th, that immigrant communities have always been part of the story of independence, that they had access to the news of independence the same way as their Anglo-American neighbors, and that the Declaration was translated, literally within a few days of July 4th by German printers who were steeped in the language of revolution. Melchior Steiner and Charles Sist, who produced this broadside, which is on view at the Museum of the American Revolution right now, they had also translated Common Sense, Thomas Paine's influential pamphlet. So they really understood how to translate the Declaration and keep that emotional, powerful language that is within it. So that's Philadelphia. But as we move out of Philadelphia, we have to remember that it took time for news to spread. Only people really within Old City Philadelphia would have known about the Declaration of Independence on July 4th. It would have taken time for it to reach the rest of the United States and then to spread to the other side of the Atlantic. So within this timeline, I have just a few examples of different printings of the Declaration. This is a newspaper which was printed in New York, in Manhattan, by John Holt. And he gave interesting instructions to his readers. He printed the Declaration on the back page of his newspaper, sort of formatted as if it were a broadside. And he gave this note to his readers that he formatted the Declaration in that way to oblige a number of his customers who intend to separate it from the rest of the paper and fix it up in open view in their houses as a mark of their approbation of the independent spirit of their representatives. So this is what Holt's newspaper printing looked like. Again, it has that sort of feel of a broadside or a handbill instead of the narrow columns of a newspaper. Now, whether any of Holt's subscribers actually listened to his suggestion to post the Declaration up in their houses, we don't know. What we do know is that within a few weeks of this printing, the British occupied New York City. So it was a bold move for a printer to advise his audience to post the Declaration up as a mark of their patriotic spirit when the British ships were amassing on the other side of the harbor and were preparing to attack New York. If we head up to New Hampshire, this printing of the Declaration in one sentence has two homophones. It has the wrong than and the wrong to in the phrase you see here. And this could be a case of whoever was setting the type not being good at spelling, not knowing which then or which to use. I think it could also be evidence that someone was reading the Declaration aloud to the person composing the text, rather than them reading it off of a printed or manuscript copy of the text. So these kinds of typos might actually be clues to the process of publishing the news. If we really want to see some typos, the Massachusetts Spy delivers on that. This was printed in Worcester for many years by Isaiah Thomas, but he handed control of his newspaper over to two individuals who were not very skilled as printers just before the Declaration of Independence. And so he trusted these men with his newspaper, and they didn't quite live up to that trust. In that very famous second sentence of the Declaration, rather than saying we hold these truths to be self-evident, it says we hold these truths to us self-evident. And then it says they are endowed by their creatot instead of creator. And then in the final paragraph, you can see the typo free and independent states. None of these errors would have significantly impacted how people understood the text of the Declaration, but they do show us the haste with which printers were working to get the text in front of their readers. Now, newspapers are a great way of understanding exactly when the news of independence would have reached different parts of the United States, but they can also be misleading. So just as a quick example, this is the Boston Gazette's printing of the Declaration, but it was not printed in Boston. It was printed in Watertown, which was across the river from Boston, because Benjamin Eades had evacuated Boston during the British occupation of that city, and he kept the name of his newspaper the same, even though he was no longer in its original location. If we head down to Williamsburg, Virginia, We see the first and only time in the United States when the Declaration was printed in part rather than in full. This is in Alexander Purdy's Virginia Gazette. He printed the final 3 paragraphs of the Declaration with a promise that he would print the text in full in the next week's issue. The reason for this is he did not have any space left in his newspaper for the week by the time the Declaration arrived in Williamsburg. You can see here that it fits on the sort of middle spread of his newspaper, takes up about 2/3 of a column, and the rest of the columns are filled with news. And the one story that really takes up the most space in Purdy's newspaper is an account from Gwynn's Island. And so this is a piece of news which actually outshone the Declaration, which this printer prioritized over the Declaration. And the reason is that this account from Gwynn's Island described the horrific conditions of individuals who had been enslaved, who had sought freedom with Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia. He had issued a proclamation in late 1775 offering freedom to anyone who joined the British side of the conflict. And so many of these people flocked to him, and there was disease that was running rampant. And so when Dunmore left Gwynn's Island after a skirmish with Continental forces, he left behind hundreds of dead and dying formerly enslaved people who had tried to self-emancipate by coming to join him. And the reason why this Williamsburg printer, Alexander Purdy, privileged this news over printing the Declaration in its entirety was that this was seen as a cautionary tale, that individuals who were enslaved were actually better off on their plantations than they were seeking freedom with the British. And so Purdy wanted this news to get out from Williamsburg so that other printers could copy it, and other enslavers could kind of use it as a warning about the perils that awaited people who tried to seek their own freedom. So Alexander Purdy did print the Declaration in full in the next week's issue of his Virginia Gazette. Unfortunately for him, though, there were 2 Virginia Gazettes at this time in Williamsburg. Both newspapers had the same name, and his competitors printed the Declaration in full the day after he printed only an extract of it. So it shows the business decisions that printers were considering when they were publishing the Declaration. Now, if we trace the Declaration across the Atlantic, it actually traveled on British mail ships from New York to the south of England, and then was printed in London. And from there, the Declaration was printed all over Europe in all sorts of different languages. I think I have like 10 or 11 different languages in the book. This is the first London printing of the Declaration on August 16th, 1776, so 6 weeks after July 4th. And the Declaration was printed in full in this London newspaper. But then that same day, the Declaration was printed in a way that it was self-censored. So certain references to the king as a tyrant were replaced with these long dashes, which you can see in the text. And this was a way of trying to get around the fact that the Declaration is not so much about the independent United States as it is about King George III. One of my favorite censorship tactics is in the St. James's Chronicle, where the printer actually changed the pronouns in the list of grievances from he has, meaning the king, to it has, meaning Great Britain or the British government. This would have taken an incredible amount of effort, but the result is a printing of the Declaration that does not mention the king once. It's a really surreal document to read as an American. In London, the Declaration was also printed alongside misinformation. Fake news is not new, and it really informed how people in Great Britain and the rest of Europe understood the Declaration. So one of my favorite pieces of misinformation which accompanied the Declaration was about the Franklins, that Benjamin Franklin and his son William Franklin, who was the royal governor of New Jersey, had intentionally picked opposite sides in the conflict so that whoever won the war, the Franklin family would be the real winners. This is the kind of information about certain members of the Congress or about George Washington that circulates with the Declaration and serves to undermine the Congress's efforts. Every self-censorship tactic that was applied in Britain was then copied by printers in other languages, in other places. So you can see here a Dutch newspaper where the references to the king have been erased either through long dashes, asterisks, or a bracketed note skipping over the list of grievances. Unfortunately for this printer, his audience was actually really curious about the colonists' complaints about the king. So he had to print them in the following issue of his newspaper. Somehow he tracked them down from another London printing and was able to publish them with an apology to his readers for not understanding what they were interested in reading. And then, as I mentioned, the book concludes in January 1777 with this printing. This is Mary Catherine Goddard's broadside of the Declaration, which is the first printing with the names of all of the men who had signed the parchment copy. Goddard also printed her own full name at the bottom of this broadside. Many women were working in printing offices at this time, but not very many had their name on the final product. So she clearly took some pride in being able to print her own full name at the bottom of the Declaration. She typically printed under her initials M.K. Goddard, which it wouldn't be necessarily obvious that it was a female printer. I gave the caveat that she printed the names of the men who had signed the Declaration by that time, because Thomas McKean of Delaware had not. And so even though Goddard's printing in January 1777 marks the end of the time when the Declaration was news, the messiness continues. So with that, I would welcome questions from Karin and other folks about this time when the Declaration of Independence was news, and the different stories that reveal how people received that information.
Thank you so much, Emily. That was fascinating. And although I've been familiar with your work for quite a long time, I never fail to learn something new when you speak about it. Just fantastic. Thank you so much. And just to let everyone know, you can put a question in the Q&A function, I believe, or put it in the chat, and I will pose it to Emily. But I'm going to start out by asking you about something you addressed right off the bat, which was, well, maybe partway through when you were talking about the Dunlap, and then talking about the wonderful Steiner and Sist broadside, which is the role of immigrants in the production of so many of these revolutionary texts. Thomas Paine was a relatively recent immigrant. Charles Thompson was an Irish immigrant. His is the name that appears most frequently, in addition to Hancock, of course, associated with the Declaration, and Dunlap, of course. So I wondered if you could talk about specifically the role of immigrants in printing and production kind of in this moment, because I mean, there's a lot to say about immigrant philosophers and politicians and writers and so on, but printing in particular seems important.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's not surprising that immigrants are the first people to produce the Declaration because they have this sort of entrepreneurial spirit. You know, in the case of John Dunlap, he probably received some training in Northern Ireland and then came to Philadelphia seeking that American dream, you know, trying to set up his own business and clearly earning the respect of the Continental Congress in the process. And from here, he's entrusted with other tasks, printing the journals of the Continental Congress, eventually the Constitution. So he clearly was a trusted immigrant entrepreneur. Same thing with Melchior Steiner and Charles Sist. Charles Sist he has one of my favorite stories. He had been born in St. Petersburg in a German enclave there. He was educated in Europe. It's possible that he was the real brains behind the translation process because of his European education. He then returned to Russia after school And as I like to say, he became enough of a revolutionary to be exiled to Siberia. And then from there, he was able to escape and sail to Philadelphia and become part of the printing community there, where he prints the Declaration and Common Sense and all of these important tracts. So I think there's a sort of revolutionary spirit in many of these printers. That's not to say that there weren't also more loyalist leaning printers, including immigrant printers in the colonies. But I think we have some fascinating examples of people who made an effort to come here, to create a business, and then to be part of the establishment of the new nation of the United States.
Thank you. That's so great. Um, okay, another question I want to ask you about is just the nature of broadsides. I know when people think about the Declaration of Independence, obviously they think about that parchment thing that's at the National Archives. We've already disabused them of that. That's a
Mhm.
later production. Um, but can you talk about why the Declaration would have been printed specifically as a broadside? Like, what's the meaning of broadsides? I love that evidence that you have from New York about the instruction there from Holt. Like, you can take it out and you can pin it up, like, anyway. But talk to us about a little bit about the broadside and what that format means and what it allows and what it suggests about what people might have been doing with it.
Yeah, I get a lot of questions about broadsides, or sometimes they're called broadsheets as well. The concept is that it's the text printed on one side of a large piece of paper. And the intention for that is that these broadsides could be used for public readings of the Declaration. If you can imagine someone standing on the steps of a courthouse or sitting on top of a horse to be above a crowd and reading from one of these broadsides. I think that's the image that we have in our heads of how the Declaration was sort of transmitted to the people with this long sort of scroll of paper, much more so than seeing the Declaration squeezed into the narrow columns of a newspaper. Broadsides were typically larger than handbills. They, were something that was meant to be posted up in public spaces. So it's possible that some of these broadsides of the Declaration would have been posted up in businesses, in taverns, outside of public spaces. There's some physical evidence to support that, bits of wax in the corners of different copies of the Declaration. But these broadsides were also very ephemeral. They were not meant to survive 250 years. So we're very lucky to have the broadsides that we have. They reflect individuals having the foresight to preserve these particular printings of the Declaration. One of my favorite broadsides is at the JCB, which was owned by a soldier in the Continental Army. And thank goodness he wrote a note on the back of his broadside explaining that he had purchased it when he was a soldier, when the Declaration was first celebrated in Boston. And because of that note, we're able to, reconstruct the history of the document. Most other broadsides don't have that level of detail about their provenance. But we do know that they were meant to be sort of short-term solutions for spreading the news very quickly. And the Declaration was typically formatted in a single or two-column sort of setting so that they could be easily set, easily printed, and easily read by the speakers at these public readings of the Declaration.
Emily, I always love when you talk about the Daniel Gould Declaration because we love it too, obviously. And another thing we love about it is that Daniel Gould writes right under John Hancock and Charles Thompson's printed names. He writes "agreed to by Daniel Gould," like he's his own John Hancock
Yes,
there, which is so
exactly.
fantastic. It's like this moment of that we imagine happened all the time, which is that people heard the words of the Declaration of Independence and thought, yes, I agree to that. And here he does it in ink. It's
Yeah.
so great. It's why it's the centerpiece, of course, of our current exhibit. But are there other copies? Like you have seen more copies of the Declaration of Independence than anybody I know. Um, maybe than anybody should. I don't know. But how many copies of the Declaration, of the broadside declarations, have that kind of personal imprint, that kind of marginal, comment, or that kind of evidence of interaction with the
Hmm.
text?
The answer is not very many. Most of the surviving Dunlap broadsides, that first printing, are pretty clean. They don't have annotations on them. Even the Dunlap broadsides, which have a provenance dating back to George Washington, um, are not labeled. He didn't write on them my copy of the Declaration or anything. Um, some of the broadsides that have the best sort of annotations and kind of material evidence were created in Massachusetts. And in particular, um, Ezekiel Russell created broadsides of the Declaration, which were meant to be sent out to every parish in Massachusetts to be read aloud by the minister there and then deposited with the town clerk. And so on the back of these Russell broadsides, they are docketed to individual ministers all across Massachusetts. So it'll say to the Reverend X in whatever town in Massachusetts. And sometimes ministers would add their own record of receipt on the back of the declaration, or give some indication of, I read this, I did as I was told on this specific date. One of my favorite Russell broadsides, which is in the Huntington Library, um, stayed with the minister who read it. For whatever reason, he did not deposit it with the town clerk as he was instructed to do. And when one of his descendants was writing a family history, he came across this Russell broadside of the Declaration, which had been sent to this minister in 1776. And this, very family history oriented descendant wrote a note on it saying, "Keep in the family." Well, the fact that it's in a major institution shows that it did not stay within the family. So there's not only handfuls of annotations from 1776, but there are these later notes which try to give some sort of context to when the Declaration was, first held by a particular person or used for a particular purpose. But I wish we had more stories like Daniel Gould's that show someone engaging with the Declaration in such a specific way, and especially in his case, a soldier agreeing to independence, signing his name to it, pledging himself in the fight.
Yeah, it's really a remarkable object for sure, and it never fails to get attention from people who come and visit. Um, can I ask you a little bit more about the kinds of choices that printers were making? Because you talked about some of the mistakes they made in spelling errors, also some of the choices they had in kind of single column or double column, which really does change how we view the broadside. Like it looks really different when it's got those two columns versus just one set of text. It's a quite different document. And I notice in some of the copies that we have, so that Galen Eads one, that the Daniel Gould is a Boston broadside, and then we have the Southwicks. That's the typography is different. What they decide to put in all caps at the top, is it in Congress assembled, or is it, Declaration of Independence? What do you think are the most important choices that printers made when they got the text and they were trying to scramble to figure out how to print it? And why did they have to make the choices they did? Were those considered choices, or were those like strategic choices?
That's a great question. I think some strategic choices definitely factored in. For example, there's a lone survival at the Boston Public Library of a Connecticut broadside, the only broadside we know of that was printed in Connecticut, where the printers actually created a typesetting in two columns and used it both in their newspaper and as a broadside. So that tells me limited time in the week, limited staff power. Let's just use the same thing in two different settings. And the result is that it looks awkward on both applications. The two columns in the broadside don't quite match up evenly. And then in the newspaper, it's not the usual number of columns for the newspaper. So it just fits awkwardly on the page, and other bits of advertisements are kind of scattered around it at random. So there's those kinds of strategic choices. I also learned from the Common Press, which is at the University of Pennsylvania Libraries this year. They've been working on the Declaration completely from scratch, setting John Dunlap's typesetting, and also going through the whole process from collecting rags to make the paper to actually producing the final
That's a neat
product of the
project.
Declaration. Yeah, it's incredible. And there's a certain amount of expertise that I was able to offer them, but then they have the practical side of things, which has been really informative for me. And so one of the things that came out of that project was a realization that if you organize the Declaration in that one wide column, the way that John Dunlap and other printers did, it's easier to fix your mistakes. You don't have to think about the formatting of two columns and sort of adjusting the spacing of words, or fixing multiple lines. So that could be a practical, strategic decision. And then there are some decisions that printers make that I think are more considerations of the power of the text. So especially the words that printers choose to capitalize, and in particular to use all capital letters to emphasize. We get most of those usages in the final paragraph of the Declaration. Free and independent states is almost always in all caps. And so that just shows that is the key part of the Declaration. And later in the Declaration's long history, we see printers and lithographers using different capitalization choices, which emphasize life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and more of the language that we're familiar with. But in 1776, we can see that printers were prioritizing that statement of, we are now an independent nation. Mary Catherine Goddard, when she prints her broadsides, she uses small capital letters for all the references to a divine power. So the creator, providence, she uses small capital letters for that. And I would think that that is her own sort of choice to emphasize those references. And at the time that she's printing the Declaration, it's the winter of 1776 to 77, not quite as bad as the following winter at Valley Forge, but still not great. And so I like thinking about her invoking that divine power and saying, we really don't know if independence is going to happen, and we have to a certain degree, leave it up to a higher power to see if we're going to actually become independent or not. So we do get a sense, I think, of some of the printers' priorities and their own beliefs in how they formatted the text, and how they emphasize certain parts over others. But I do think a lot of the visuals that we see are practical considerations based on their manpower constraints, and the fact that they're printing during wartime and they don't have all the time in the world to devote to this document.
It's so interesting. It's just really fascinating how you think about what's happening in the printing and what that reveals about ideas and values behind the printer, as well as the practical constraints they're dealing with. Do you have any evidence, or should we think about any evidence about how the text was read, and if there's any relationship between how it was typeset and how it was read? That is, do we think that people who were reading it were emphasizing free and independent, because it's all capped? Or is there no evidence really of the relationship between the typesetting and the reading aloud, which we know was so, so important for people's experience of and news of the Declaration?
Yeah, I think I have to assume that if you are, a sheriff or a minister or someone who's responsible for reading the Declaration aloud, and you come to a phrase that's in all capital letters, you're going to give it a little extra oomph. So I do think whether printers were intentionally signaling that to their audience or not, I do think that's how any human who's reading a text aloud would treat it. There are some cases where I do think a printer was trying to give more signals of which parts of the Declaration are important, whether that's by indenting in a certain way so that you get a sense of like, okay, pause here and then resume. In the lengthy list of grievances, which is quite repetitive because most of
Mm.
them begin, he has.
Mm.
There's one broadside that I know of where about halfway through the list of grievances, you start to see tick marks to the left of each grievance. And that tells me that the guy lost his place as he was reading the Declaration aloud and needed to start keeping track. Very human sort of experience there. Ezekiel Russell's broadsides that he prints in Massachusetts, which he prints knowing that they're going to be sent out to ministers to be read aloud. He uses the most capital, all capital letters, small capital letters, and italics in his printing compared to every other printer in 1776. And I think he was trying to give the readers a sense of which words to really emphasize or give more attention to. For example, the phrase manly firmness, he uses italics and small caps for that. And that just, it comes in the list of grievances. It's not a well-known phrase in the Declaration, but it's something that he wanted to draw attention to. So I think there is this sort of relationship between the printers and the readers, trying to present the text in such a way that it is easy to read. And in that case, the long single column actually is easier to read because you don't have text breaks that might cause confusion or might cause a reader to stumble over their words. But then also using some visual cues to inform how the Declaration was delivered to the people. Because the Continental Congress largely left it up to everyone else involved in the process to determine how the Declaration would be presented. Their instructions are just, publish it in whatever way makes the most sense for your community. And so it is a sort of relationship between the printers and the readers and the clerks and the sheriffs and all these people involved to figure out, okay, how do we present the Declaration to the public? How do we communicate it effectively? It only takes like 15 minutes to read the Declaration, but those 15 minutes really matter.
That's great. Thank you. I just want to remind folks that you can put questions in the Q&A or you can put it in the chat and I will read them to Emily. Okay, so I want to talk about the most important thing, which of course is Rhode Island. And I'm wondering if
Of
you
course.
can, of course, exactly. I mean, I love Virginia too, and I do love the competing printing in Virginia. That's fantastic. You didn't even talk about Lord Dunmore stealing the printing press. That's
Yeah.
awesome. That's really great. There's so much to say about what's going on. That happens in Rhode Island too. Well, they don't steal it, but the French have this sub rosa kind of printing press off the coast during the occupation. But can you talk about Southwick and the printing of the Southwick broadside in Newport?
Yeah, I did a speaking engagement at the Newport Historical Society a few weeks ago. And I was, only a few feet away from Solomon Southwick's printing press, which is just so fun when you can have, the prop to explain what you're talking about. And speaking of printing presses, Solomon Southwick, he, is using the printing press, which Benjamin Franklin's older brother had originally used. So it has this history to it. And shortly after the Declaration, Southwick chooses to disassemble the press, and the story goes that he buried it in his garden to keep the British forces from being able to use the printing press. And he's one of a number of printers who make that decision that they would rather disassemble their printing presses than have them fall into British hands. It speaks to the power of print media during wartime. But Solomon Southwick's broadsides are interesting because, um, first of all, there's a version that he creates which is dated June 1776.
We have that
Obviously,
one.
he's not a time traveler. He just made a typo. Um, but the better known version of his broadside was printed specifically to be distributed in Rhode Island in sort of official purposes. So he creates broadsides which are to be used to read the Declaration aloud in Newport, where he's based, but also in Providence. And there's this sense, in Rhode Island, it's a pretty small state. News travels very quickly. But there's still this sense of we need to have enough readings of the Declaration in public spaces to make sure that all the people are informed of the Declaration. And this comes, after Rhode Island had already declared their independence from the king back in May. So I like Southwick's broadsides, and he also prints the Declaration in his Newport newspaper because they do signal the importance of making sure that everyone is aware of this change, regardless of the size of the state. In places like Virginia or the Carolinas or even Pennsylvania, it would have taken a long time for broadsides to travel to every locale. In Rhode Island, it didn't take quite as long.
And it's true, right, that the Southwick is actually the rarest of the Declaration broadsides now. There are fewer surviving examples of the Southwick. We
Yeah,
like
very
that too.
few. Yes, as compared to, Ezekiel Russell's broadsides in Massachusetts, because they had this, instruction to deposit the Declaration with the town clerks. A lot of the Russell broadsides still remain in the town
Mm.
clerk's offices or in local historical societies. Whereas with the Southwick, there are not very many surviving copies. So, yeah, like I said, broadsides were not meant to last unless they received specific help to be preserved in the archives. We're lucky to have the ones we have.
So let's talk a little bit about the other places where the Declaration appeared and the other ways that it was sent. Like you mentioned newspapers, we know that it appears in the Pennsylvania Magazine in that year as well. What are some of the other places where we should think about the text of the Declaration and where it appeared and where and how that text actually traveled?
Yeah, more places than you would expect. There is a treaty meeting between the state of Massachusetts and indigenous chiefs from the Wolastoqiyik and Mi'kmaq nations in Watertown, Massachusetts, where the declaration it arrived in the middle of the treaty meeting. It was translated into French for the chiefs who knew that language. And then the last paragraph of the declaration was incorporated into the first paragraph of the treaty that resulted from this conference. So just because it arrived in the middle of their meeting, it becomes a part of this new document. We also see the declaration excerpted in different state constitutions, which passed in 1776, including Pennsylvania's. There are manuscript copies of the Declaration. In Massachusetts, some of the town clerks wrote out the Declaration by hand in the town record books, which is fun because some of them seized their moment to put as much style on their handwriting as possible. And so we really get a sense of their clerk personality from how they transcribe the Declaration. But there's also a number of manuscript copies of the Declaration which were created by British clerks. There were many copies of the Declaration that ended up in British hands. I have a whole chapter on that in my book. And then clerks, as part of the sort of British administrative system, created manuscript copies in duplicate or triplicate, which survive in the British archives. One of the first instances of the Declaration traveling the Atlantic is a British mail ship, the Mercury, which was loaded with thousands of pieces of mail, including probably a few printed copies of the Declaration. but also a handwritten copy, which was done by a clerk who was working under Vice Admiral Molyneux Schuldum, who was docked on a ship in New York Harbor. And so this clerk clearly had received a printed copy of the Declaration. It was the only one they had. They didn't want to send it back to London. They wanted to hold on to it. So they created a manuscript, put that on the mail ship, and it ended up with the Earl of Sandwich, who was Lord of the Admiralty at this time. And that manuscript is now part of the Royal Museum at Greenwich, and is actually part of their 250th commemoration. So there's the obvious copies of the Declaration, the signed parchment, the Dunlap broadsides, which are a recognizable visual. But there's also all sorts of different newspapers, manuscripts, books, magazines where the Declaration appeared in 1776. So it really is all over the place.
I have two more questions for you, Emily. One is if you had to do a visual of the text of the Declaration in July, from July of 76 through January of 77, the period that your book covers, what would that visual look like in terms of would the text intensity increase over that period? Is
Mm.
there like was it really intense like production and circulation in July and then it tapers off? Like what does that look like?
I think if you account for not only the US, but the international audience as well, the Declaration being printed in the Caribbean and in Europe, I think it works out to a bell curve
Mm,
because the Declaration continues to spread in Europe through the fall. I've seen it printed in Italian newspapers in September. It takes some time to spread. So there definitely is a sort of maybe a 2 or 3 month lull between when the Declaration has circulated as far as it possibly can in newspapers and when Mary Catherine Goddard prints her copy of the Declaration in January 1777. But during that time, commentary about the Declaration continues.
mm,
And the King's speech at the opening of Parliament comes on Halloween. And there's quite a bit of commentary in the British press around the Declaration at that time. So there really is a sort of bell curve that is consistent. Um, the flip side of that, though, is um, the Declaration, as anyone who has lived through a moment like this knows, and I think the corollary for us would be the pandemic. For a lot of people, the Declaration was news for a day, and then they moved on to the next big thing. You really can't spend that much time thinking about it. There's a soldier at Fort Ticonderoga who wrote that the Declaration made a little buzz, but was soon forgotten about. And I think that's the reality of this kind of moment happening in the middle of a war with a lot of
mm.
uncertainty still. So although the news continued to be reprinted and analyzed in different contexts, I think for a lot of people, it was a day, a week, a month, and then they were on to the next thing.
Which is remarkable for us to think about, but really July 4th was just a Thursday, you
Exactly.
know? Okay, last question. How many copies of the Declaration, never mind however you account for that, manuscript, broadside, whatever, have you handled and looked at?
Oh
Do you
gosh.
actually even know?
I don't know if I know offhand. I will say I am the beneficiary of digitization for sure. My book could not have been written even 10 years ago because so much has been digitized, including the European newspaper archives.
Mm,
That's what I spent the pandemic working on when this book was my dissertation. I was, combing through European newspapers. I would have never been able to do that work in person. So I would say I've probably handled a few dozen copies of the Declaration in my own hands, but hundreds in the digital realm. And so I'll chalk it up to the archivists and the people who are responsible for that digitization work, because it really does make it possible to tell a much broader and more far-reaching story than previous historians of the Declaration have been able to do.
Fantastic. Well, on that note, I'm going to just remind everyone that the JCB's exhibit, 1776 Across the Americas, which has the Daniel Gould Declaration of Independence in it, is in digital form, and you can access it on our website. So, with that, thank you so much, Emily, for sharing your expertise and your enthusiasm with us. It's such a pleasure as always.
Thank you. This was a lot of fun.
Take care. Bye bye.